So, believe it or not, I am quite emotional. This is a big thing, guys. But anyway, I'll try to do my best. When I was trying to prepare this presentation, I faced two problems. The first is how to summarize 30 years in 30 minutes. But the other was that as I was trying to tell the story of the lab, I keep falling in my own personal story. And the reason is that in my head, I struggled to separate my own professional career and the development of the lab. So in the end, I decided to give it up. And what I'm offering you is my own personal view of the history of the Laboratorio di Tecnologia Medica. So let's start from my own history. I was a student in mechanical engineering, and I had two influential professors, Alessandro Freddi and Gabriele Molari. Alessandro taught experimental mechanics, and Molari taught computer-aided engineering. But because I was a computer nerd, this is my first computer, believe it or not, I decided to do my thesis with Professor Molari, which at that time was working with people like Glauco Mazzotti to the development of one of the first solid modeler in the world, Aliseo. So I had fantastic opportunity of learning in that period. I ended up working on shape optimization, and I started to do in a very confused way what today would be called bio-inspired computer-aided optimization, looking at tree remodeling and things like that. One of the papers that really impressed me, although I think I understood probably 10% of it at that time, was this paper from Dennis Carter and David Fiery about bone remodeling. This idea that our skeleton would adapt to changes in the biomechanical environment somehow impressed my mechanical engineer head. But yeah, this was just an intellectual exercise until in 1989, this is me at that time, I moved from the University of Bologna to the University of Florida to work with Professor Ali Sirek. And at that time, there was not much communication. So when I got there, I really have no idea what I was supposed to do with Professor Sirek. And he said, look, I don't care about what you're doing in Bologna. I think you should do biomechanics. At the beginning, I was terrified because my knowledge of biology was pretty much zero. But eventually, I accepted the challenge. I started to work. And when I left the United States, I had submitted what would become my first publication, a paper on a damage-based theory for bone remodeling that was published in 1990. That somehow set the fate of my further career because I was so in love with biomechanics that I decided that was what I wanted to do in my life. And then there is a lot of luck in my personal history. Another lucky passage was that by some very random events, I ended up talking with Armando Giunti, and he offered me a job to start up a lab. At that time, it was tentatively called Materials Technology Lab in the newly established Codivilla Putti Research Center. Rizzoli was a well-known orthopedic hospital, but he was making this transition to a research hospital. At that time, we only have these two pictures. These are Polaroids, and the older of you might remember this instantaneous development films. But what they show are empty space. And that's, in fact, what I got. I got 600 square meters of empty labs, about €1 billion, which would be roughly something in the order of €1 million, to buy instrumentation. And notice, I had less than 2 years of a research experience at that time. I had absolutely no clue what to do. And in fact, our first decent paper came out 5 years after. And these 5 years were really years where we try to understand what could be done in the most general sense possible. I had this money to spend. I went to talk to Professor Freddi. He listened to me and he said, well, you probably need an hydraulic testing machine. So we bought an Instron, an 8501, which is still working amazingly after 30 years. And then I wanted to buy computers, of course, and at that time, the absolute best in computer-aided engineering was Intergraph. So we bought two Intergraph workstation. The official price of this workstation at that time was $500,000, hardware and software. We paid much less than this, but still we paid a fortune, and after only a few years we trashed them because they become brutally obsolete. But that's the way it is. Giunti gave the leadership of the lab to a younger surgeon, Aldo Toni, who had just designed a new anatomical cementless hip replacement called ANCA. And so the idea was maybe we could look into this. But honestly, we were very confused about what we could do. And this is the proof of our early attempt. This is an historical picture, 1990. We are in Riga, in Latvia. You can see myself, Aldo Toni, Arturo Natali, director of the medical faculty of Riga, John Middleton, that probably many of you remember, and Ivar Knetz, who was director of the Technical University of Riga at that time. Ivar died a few years ago. Aldo managed to insert us in this EU-funded project, which was about ceramic. Honestly, we had no clue what we were supposed to do there. But for me, it was a huge opportunity to start internationalize, to meet people from other countries, etc. Fabio joined me, and we were given a pretty dirty job. They said, well, look, we are checking bone remodeling and comparing X-ray of the same patient. You should make this quantitative. But, everything available at that time was 8 bits, and analogic X-rays had about 12, 14 bits of gray level. So we developed a homemade way to do the dynamic range expansion, which was published in '92. Really, a key person in this work was Maurizio Abate, who is a hardware provider who gave us a lot of help in this work. And I got in touch again with Maurizio after many, many years, 2 weeks ago. So serendipity again in action. Interestingly, when we finally had a working system, we demonstrated that information was not in the X-ray, in the sense that the variability due to the chemical development of the film would be larger than what we were supposed to measure. So essentially, we couldn't make a quantitative measurement. So overall, it was a failure. Also, of course, we learned a lot in the process. Same was for this thing. Aldo Toni had this idea, which was a great idea. Take an Elizarov external fixator, add some robotic control to it, and use it to do automatic extension and realignment of bone segment in fracture fixation. So in order to avoid the high radiation dose on the hands of the orthopedic surgeon who has to perform this maneuver manually under the BIVU, under the continuous X-ray system. It was a great idea, but we had no clue about robotics. I mean, I never studied robotics, and so we did something. It kind of worked, but obviously this was not our job. So my level of confusion was very, very high at that time. And then finally I had a breakthrough. I went to my first conference, my first serious conference, the 8th Congress of the European Society of Biomechanics, which was organized in '92 by Aurelio Capozzo in Rome. And there I met for the first time some of the key people of biomechanics in Europe in that time: Rick Iskey, John O'Connor, Peter Walker, Aurelio himself, who remain a friend for all our career. For me, this was a key moment because I realized that really what I could do, that the topic where I did have some decent skill was biomechanics, and that's what we had to focus on. Luca Cristofolini the other day told me a story. At that time, he was a student, and but he was already curious about biomechanics. So he wrote to Aurelio Capozzo and he said, well, I'm a student. I heard there is a conference. And Aurelio invited him to attend the conference for free. And he even gave him accommodation at the Olympic village where the event was organized, again for free. So Luca was an auditor at this conference as a young student. And this was the style of our friend Aurelio Capozzo. Okay, but the real big event for me, the breakthrough in terms of networking, is another conference the year after, the International Society of Biomechanics, 1993. I'm pretty sure a few of you remember that conference. It was an amazing conference, both from a scientific point of view, but also from a social point of view. We had our banquet on the Bateau Mouche, going on the river across Paris, amazing. And there I met and started my friendship with people who remain key reference for me across my career. I put some name here. I'm sure you recognize many of them. I also put Roberto Fogliardi, who is not a biomechanician, but again to show the serendipity and the networking. Roberto at that time was a student in bioengineering. At the conference, we met each other, we became friends, and then he decided to take a completely different career. He went working for a company called Aetra, and Fabio Barufaldi and I worked with him a few years after when we were working in the telemedicine sector. So again, it's a small word. And finally, we started to work on biomechanics. Luca Cristofolini joined first as a master student thesis, then he started his PhD, and in '95 he published the first biomechanics paper of our lab. At that time, it was a beautiful work, looking at the effect of each muscle on the deformation of the femur. In reality, we were preparing to our success, even if, this first year are pretty opaque in terms of publications, results, and what's not. But so I tried to think what made this very humble beginnings into a success story. And I think that there are four things: luck, hard work, stubbornness, and then there is something that in Italian is ignorantezza, and if you don't know what it is, look at Paolo Cevoli video on ignorantezza. I tried to translate it in English with ignorantness. It means that in spite of the fact you don't know, you jump behind the barrier and you do things that you're probably not ready for, but with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy, somehow you compensate your shortcoming, and by trial and error, eventually you succeed. I think we had a lot of that. We were very arrogant. We were very, not arrogant, how can I say? We were ignorantness. It's a definition. And in fact, 1996 is the year where we opened the wings. The labs become international. That year we have two overseas visitors, Tim Harrigan from the United States and Brian McNamara, that will work with us for 2 years. And we published a number of papers that year, and each of those papers is somehow the seed of something. So with Tim Harrigan, I published a paper on bone remodeling, somehow the continuation of my initial work with Professor Sirek. We published a paper on the effect of autoclaving on banked bovine bone. At that time, we had the mad cow disease, and this was the first time where a clinician came to us with a practical problem, and we did a research and helped them to solve that practical problem. And this then became a pattern for our lab. We are a very translational lab that works very close to the clinical practice. We published the first paper on describing, for the first time in the literature, the fretting wear and fretting corrosion mechanism in modular neck hyperostasis. We've published a first paper on the design of a hip joint simulator, and then soon after Roberto Cianci joined us, and then Saverio came in, and the whole tribology department in our lab started. Luca, what is still today probably one of the most cited papers of our group, where he did a systematic comparison between composite material bone analogous and actual cadaver bones. And then Massimiliano Casali and I published the standardized femur program. Again, this was a seed. In itself, it was not much. We simply made available publicly a CAD model of these bone analogs so that people could easily model without wasting time. But it was the beginning of a computational activity. This was started with a collaboration between our lab and the Cineca Institute, the Supercomputing Center in Bologna. This is a collaboration that has been running since then. What we were doing at that time was very rudimental. You can even see in the pictures and the resolution of the medical imaging. Again, it put the seed on many, many things that came after. One important thing was that on this project, I hired a guy from San Marino called Massimiliano Casali, and Cineca hired a young mathematician, Barbara Massari, and they worked together, and they fell in love, and they got married, and this is the result. This is Giulia Casali, the beautiful girl on the left with the leg on the word. She is a little champion of rhythmic gymnastics in San Marino. Why I'm showing you this? Because already in those years, another thing emerged. The lab was not only a place to do science, it was also a place where a lot of young people lived some fundamental years of their life, where they established their sentimental relationship, their social networks, they defined themselves professionally, and this has been an amazing journey, which I'm still enjoying today with my latest co-workers, and this is a beautiful thing. The period between 95 and 2000 is really the period of consolidation. In many regards, the assets, or the organizational asset that we adopt is still reflected in the lab today. Max Balaiani joined us, and he picked up my work on modular nets and started to work on biomechanics of materials. Saverio pushed through and develops the tribology activity. Fabio specialized in medical imaging and health technology, and Luca continues his work in experimental biomechanics. And I finally go back to my first love, and I start to develop the computational biomechanic aspects of the lab. I put the photo of these four people here, not because they are the most important, but because they are the first. Those are my co-workers that broke the ice with me and started to do computational biomechanics. Cinzia, Marek, Roberto, Deborah. There is one missing, Luisella Bellingeri. I couldn't find a picture of her online, unfortunately, but I want to mention her as well. Again, the quality of work that was done at that time was pretty rudimental, I have to say, but we learned a lot by our mistakes, and that was fundamental to improve over the years. In '99, I went to spend a short sabbatical at the University of Oxford, and this is important for two reasons. The first, that I did some beautiful work with Christina Polgar in the area of computational biomechanics. But more important, I had the opportunity to work under the supervision of John O'Connor. And in this environment, in this very conductive environment, the idea of patient-specific modeling started to form in my head. While we were doing this, the scientific productivity of the lab and the size of the lab, of course, grow almost linearly. This is the number of papers we published from 1993 to 2011, and as you can see, there's been a constant growth. The opportunity to develop this idea of patient-specific modeling came when Marco Manfrini, an orthopedic surgeon focused on pediatric oncology, came up with us with an interesting problem. How to decide if there was a risk of refracturing in the rehabilitation of children who had massive reconstruction due to tumor resection. Fulvia today just joined our group, and she picked up this project. This became her main project for a long while. And with Fulvia, we planted some of the most important seat in the computational side of the lab, developing patient-specific finite element model from CT scans, developing patient-specific multi-body dynamics models from gait analysis and MRI, and so on. This is another topical moment for me. In 2002, I went in Calgary at the World Congress of Biomechanics, and I heard a plenary lecture from this New Zealander, Peter Hunter. And Peter was giving the words to my thoughts. He was saying, yes, Marco, this idea you have of patient-specific modeling is not something that's valid only in orthopedics. It is global. We can do so much more. We can do multi-scale from the molecular to the whole body. The sky is the limit. And for me, this was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. It opened a whole new view of what we could do with our modeling techniques. This became my obsession. And following here, there was this journey that started in 2005 with the publication of the white paper where we introduced the concept of virtual physiological human in Europe, and then with a number of other events that eventually positioned Bologna and the Medical Technology Lab as one of the key players in the VPH initiative. This is another interesting element. This is the number of invited talks that we received in those years. And as you can see, we started from pretty much nothing until 2002. And then we arrived to have 13 invited talks in 1 year, which suggests that there is the prestige of our lab was growing conversely. The last decade before this one was really the period of excellence. I listed here in random order. I'm not saying they are the most important achievement, but we developed one of the best CT-based preoperative planning for hip surgery, HIPOP. Egon already explained the seminal work that he and Fabio did on the micro-CT histomorphometry. This group and Massimiliano work on the micromechanics of Cancello's bone. We see that the idea of statistical finite element model, and with it the idea of in silico trials before anyone was even knowing the term. We developed some very crazy designs for joint replacement, like the CLU stem, which was not very successful commercially, but as far as I know, there is still the best performing joint replacement ever. Massimiliano did a beautiful piece of work with Cecilia, who is presenting later today, on the effect of antibiotics on PMMA, and so on and so forth. The infamous Mitch redesign that many of you were involved in. All this work is documented in the many publications of our lab. In 2008, we won one of the largest European funding available in the VPH area, and the VPHOP project started. It was a grand science endeavor. It involved 20 organization. Opportunity of my life. I was the coordinator, and almost everyone in the lab was involved. But those were also the year where the diaspora began. The lab had become too big for the physical spaces, too big for the vision of the institute, too diversified for our narrow mandate of focusing only in orthopedic diseases. The first piece that detached from us was the software development team. And in 2006, Deborah Testi and Alessandro Chiarini left the lab and went to establish the Biocompetence Competence Center, which for 6 years developed software for biomedical research at the highest possible level. And then this became a trend. And I'm sorry if I forgot you. I put some picture of some of you here. I'm sure there are many other, but these are all people that started somehow in the lab for a little or for a longer while, and then they moved their career abroad in other countries. And they're doing beautiful work, and we already see 2 examples of Saulo and Egon this morning, and many other we'll see today. But it was a sign that we were bigger than the container. We were overflowing, okay? And this was the primary reason why in 2011 I accepted the invitation of the University of Sheffield, and I left the lab and I went to UK to establish the Insignio Institute for In Silico Medicine. I had this desire to demonstrate that in silico medicine required grand science, large institute with a lot of collaborators, a lot of academics with different expertise. And the history showed that I was right. I mean, after 7 years when I left Sheffield, these were the figures of the Insignio Institute, and it's been and still is a very successful initiative. Now, back to Bologna, 2018, later 2018, I rejoined the University of Bologna and the Ristoli Institute, and now there is the present. And the present is shining. This is a picture that represents the vision of the lab today. We can cover all the bases of the entire life cycle of health technologies for neuromusculoskeletal diseases. And I give you two numbers. In 2019, we published 35 papers, and this was the largest number ever. So last year was the best performing year in the 30 years of history of the lab. And we attracted over 3 million of new funding in the last year or 2 years or so. So these are good figures that show that the lab is very healthy and is growing again at an important pace. I'm not going into the detail, but there is a million of things going on, very exciting. We're talking about patient-reported outcomes in the RIPO registry. We're talking about new schools of in silico trials. The MIMAS project is looking at the MRI safety of joint replacements, and so on and so forth. We just got a huge grant from the European Commission, 8 million, in a project called In Silico World that starts in January. So a lot of future ahead. And in fact, I would like to close with a famous sentence from Winston Churchill. Now, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, and I'm pretty sure of it, the end of the beginning. I thank you very much.